LiSTNR production.
On the 9th of April 1995, a rental truck was unassumingly parked in front of a federal building in Oklahoma City. Seconds later, the truck exploded. 169 people, including children, were killed. Almost instantly, a massive investigation unfolded. Jeff Lanza, a seasoned FBI agent, was deeply involved. In this Rewind episode of Crime Insiders, Jeff joins host Brent Sanders to share insight from this case and many others from his time in the FBI.
So the event took place in Oklahoma City, which is about 3 hours south of Kansas City. The planning, the mixing of the bomb all took place in Kansas, which is part of the territory for the Kansas City FBI where I worked as an agent at that time. And a summary of the events, if I could provide that for you, occurred when Timothy McVeigh rented basically a truck from a rider rental truck agency in Kansas and drove to a lake in a very secluded area and filled it up with the ammonium nitrate and also the fertilizer that was used, the racing fuel that was used to create that bomb that destroyed that building. So he drove down by himself. Now, he had help of another person named Terry Nichols, who's still in jail today. He drove down to Oklahoma City and placed that truck in front of the building, lit the fuse, and he drove away from Oklahoma City, heading north on one of the interstates out of Oklahoma City. Now, after the bomb went off, everyone thought, including FBI, police, the U.S. government, thought this was a case of international terrorism because it just wasn't something that we would expect from a domestic terrorist blowing up a building and killing innocent Americans. So it was all focused on international terrorism. But we learned quickly after the attack from just a small piece of the truck that had been blown up that contained all the ingredients of the bomb was a vehicle identification number on an axle that was blown 500 feet from the blast site. And that vehicle identification number told us, where the truck, or who owned that truck, and it belonged to a rider rental truck agency in Junction City, Kansas, which is, again, about 2 hours west of the FBI office in Kansas City. And so agents immediately were dispatched to that rider rental truck agency, and they said, who rented this truck? And they had a name of a guy who rented the truck. He put his name down as Robert Kling, which was an alias. He made up that name. And so Robert Kling came up as a nobody in all the records that we had, all the criminal checks. So we had an artist come in and draw a picture of who they rented that truck to. That was the best lead we had at the time. And they drew a picture of a person that they thought had rented that truck. And we took it to surrounding businesses in the area. And the agents that were in the area at that time took it to a hotel. And they showed, do you ever seen someone like this in your area? And they go, yeah, a guy like that, it looked like that, rented a room from us 2 nights before the bombing. They said, well, who was that person? And they said, well, it was a guy named Timothy McVeigh. So he used his real name to rent the room, a fake name to rent the truck, and that's how we learned the name of Timothy McVeigh. So we immediately put hey, all points bulletin out on Timothy McVeigh, and we find that he's already been arrested, but not for the bombing, for speeding in Oklahoma, driving away from the bombing site. He was about an hour and a half north, about 90 minutes north of the bombing site, arrested by a police officer because he was speeding. And now, normally that wouldn't result in someone taking you into custody, but he had a gun on his waistband. You can't carry concealed firearms in Oklahoma City at that time. And the trooper said, what do you got under the jacket? He goes, I got a firearm. He goes, get out of the car. You can't carry a concealed firearm. So they took him into custody for carrying an illegal firearm in Oklahoma. So he's sitting in jail for a day. And you can only keep people in the United States for 24 hours without further cause. So they're about to release him, and a magistrate judge that was going to hear his case was sick. So he did not hear the case. He was delayed another 24 hours in jail. And that 24 hours was the point in time, within that time, that we figured out who he was. And we said, don't release that guy. We think he's the one who blew up that building. So that's how he was caught. It was an amazing combination of law enforcement, just a normal traffic stop, pulling somebody over, and also tying that car and the picture to Timothy McVeigh. And that's how he was eventually caught.
Jeff, just to confirm that timeline, we're talking like a 48-hour period between the explosion at Oklahoma and him being charged with that by the FBI.
That's correct.
Wow.
It was April 19th was the bombing, and April 21st was when he was about to be released from jail. But at the last minute, we realized that he was the one that was most likely responsible for that bombing. That's correct.
That identikit that was put together of him, how accurate was that? Goodness me, that was so close, wasn't it? And I mean, it's one of those things, I guess, we see it on TV and things such as that, but when you see that sketch drawing that was done, that would have been done by one of your agents, somebody from in the FBI, and you put it alongside his mugshot, almost identical.
The composite drawing was unbelievably close to his actual persona and his picture. So that was a fantastic rendering of him. And that great rendering allowed us to identify him at the hotel where he had parked his truck before the bombing, before he drove down to Oklahoma City, which is about 3 hours away. And the owner of the hotel, it's just a small place called the Dreamland Hotel in Junction City, Kansas. She said, I know he was driving to ride a rental truck because he was trying to back into a space and there was an overhang. He didn't want him hitting the overhang. So I directed him in so he wouldn't hit it. And so all the pieces came together because, she knew he had the truck, looked just like the guy. The truck was there. The VIN number was associated with the truck. All the pieces came together at the right time. And he was already in custody, which is the most amazing thing.
Did he have any previous before? Like, we're looking at this 48-hour period. You know better than anyone, Jeff. If he slips through the net, if he's not pulled up by that state trooper and all these incredible events, if that judge doesn't have a dose of the flu, it could have taken so long. I mean, he could have disappeared overseas. He could have done anything, I guess.
Right, because we didn't have an identity on him. And that's correct. He would have been caught eventually, but it may have taken several days or several weeks. But he wasn't the person that was going to escape. He wasn't going to go overseas and try to escape custody for a long period of time. I think he did it with the idea that he was going to be caught, and because he, just that was his mentality at the time. We would have got him eventually, but we got lucky, and it prevented us from, it helped us catch him more quickly, which was always a good thing when you're dealing with very violent criminals who killed a lot of people.
Am I right that there was a connection between that and the Waco incident shootings that had occurred maybe a year or so earlier?
Right. So if April 19th, 1995 was a significant date for him to undertake this act, because it was exactly 2 years earlier, on April 19th, 1993, when an event took place in Waco, Texas, which was the end of a long siege by David Koresh at a facility, a compound, as they called it, in Waco, Texas, where he was basically had a shootout with Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency agents, which is another federal government agency, ATF. It happened back in February of that year. And there was a siege that went on until April 19th, where they were just holed up with a bunch of kids and others in this compound in Waco, Texas. And finally, the FBI basically decided to end this siege, and he burned the complex down. And many people died as a result of that, innocent people, because he set the place on fire. So Timothy McVeigh in his mind, was upset that the federal government had caused this to happen. And that was one of the reasons why he thought he should attack the federal government in retribution for this particular event. And the ATF, which is the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency that I just mentioned, he thought they were originally responsible for what happened there in February of that year. And then he thought he was going to attack the ATF office, and he thought the ATF office had agents in that building in that he was going to blow up in Oklahoma City, and that's why he picked that particular building to blow up. And there was a lot of collateral damage, as I mentioned. A lot of innocent people died in that attack.
Now, Jeff, the rather swift arrest of McVeigh within 48 hours after this tragic incident, and as you've quite rightly highlighted, due to a couple of strokes of luck with regards to things that occurred, that was, in hindsight, I guess, the easy part of the process. I mean, this led to an exhaustive investigation, probably one of the biggest in FBI history, to gather evidence and then prosecute this offender. Can you give the listeners just an insight into the depth and breadth of that investigation that followed his arrest?
Yeah, well, I mean, to convict somebody in federal court of a crime like that that's subject to a death penalty, which it was in the United States, requires a lot of investigative resources of the FBI. And I was involved to a minor extent in interviewing people that knew Timothy McVeigh. Just as an example, Timothy McVeigh was a member of the Army, and he was at Fort Riley, which is in Junction City, Kansas. And I interviewed his suite mate when he was in the Army, as an example of how much depth the FBI goes into to try to get a perspective on, why someone would commit such a crime and what led up to those events. So lots of work went into that in terms of, just reconstructing the crime scene, the number of deaths that was involved, the forensics of all that, what led up to the bombing, the mixing of the bomb, where he got the elements to mix the bomb, how they were able to get those and steal those from a plant in Kansas that contained the blasting caps that were used to ignite that bomb, plus the fertilizer, the racing fuel, all stolen from different places around Kansas. And that all had to be reconstructed and traced back to the original events that occurred in order to help convict him in trial. It wasn't going to be a slam dunk by any stretch, but we needed to make sure that he was going to be convicted for the crime that he committed. In addition to his colleague, his co-conspirator, Terry Nichols, who is still serving a life term in prison for that act that occurred in 1995.
Just some of the numbers around that investigation are quite mind-boggling. 28,000 interviews conducted by the FBI and possibly state troopers, 43,000 investigative leads, 3.5 tons of evidence gathered, and this last one is amazing. Close to 1 billion pieces of information that had to be gone through to put this trial together. I'm interested, 48 hours from the bombing to his arrest, how long from the arrest to the trial? How long did that period of investigation take?
The trial didn't take place because of all the delays in our criminal justice system, especially when it's a death penalty case. I don't believe the trial took place for another 2.5 years or so, and I'm not exactly sure about that. The date of the trial, but it took a while because he had a co-conspirator involved in that as well, Terry Nichols, as I mentioned. But all that evidence, it all has to be provided to the defense, and which is how we do things in our system. And they have a chance to review all that. And they would ask for delays because there was so much evidence that they had to review to look for things that they could use in the defense of both those defendants. It takes a lot of time, understandably so. When you have a death penalty case, there's a lot of delays in terms of how that case proceeds through our criminal justice system.
And just being mindful of the US, many similarities within the court system, justice system in the US as we have here in Australia, of course. But just as a point of interest, this case would have been tried. Was it tried as a death penalty case in front of a jury?
Yes, it was. And it was, they picked they also had to move the location of the trial, and that's part of our justice system as well, maybe in Australia, because they don't want to have, a biased jury. If the trial took place in Oklahoma City, it might have been more difficult to get a jury that wasn't biased by the horrible acts that occurred, and some family members and friends that would have lost, potentially lives in that case. So they moved it to Denver, Colorado, which was a venue they wouldn't have that potential bias there. So that was another factor in the case, to move it away from where the crime occurred.
What was his plea? Was it linked to mental health? How did he plead? No
mental health issues there. He pleaded not guilty. He went to trial. He was convicted by a jury of 12 citizens of the United States, and then he was sentenced to death, which took place very quickly after that because he waived all of the procedures that would have normally been in place. If someone's convicted in a death penalty case, it generally takes 10 years before that punishment is enacted. And he waived all of that, and he was put to death just a couple of years after the end of the trial. But it was a jury of his peers. There was no mental health issues. There was nothing like that was presented at trial. He just said, I'm going to trial, and we'll see what the jury says about it. And I think he wanted a platform for his views and what he thought was, he wanted to present about why he did this act as retribution for what occurred 2 years earlier, and also for for just basically his anti-government views.
And he had one known co-conspirator, that being Terry Nichols. Other than those two, the investigation found that was it, just these two. They weren't part of some larger anti-government organisation or anything such as that?
That's correct. There was a third person that was not involved in the planning, but he knew about it. He had knowledge of what was going to happen, and he did not alert authorities to it. And he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was not part of the planning and the execution of the attack, but he had knowledge of it. And one simple phone call on the part of that individual to the government could have prevented that attack from happening and saved a lot of lives.
Jeff, what would the likelihood of an Oklahoma bombing happening again? We can never say never, but are policing techniques, surveillance and everything else at a higher level now than what they were back in the 90s?
You'd like to think that it couldn't happen again, but in a free country like the United States and Australia, and I've been to Australia a couple of times, and we have similar freedoms, it would be possible for someone to get to the point where they could commit something. But what the FBI relies upon is just intelligence. You're gaining informants. You have information about people that may be involved in something or planning something, and you can disrupt those organizations or those activities before they happen. And that's really what it relies upon. You can't stop somebody from going out and buying fertilizer and racing fuel and blasting caps if they're going to steal them from a place that doesn't have enough security. That's not something that could be prevented. It's really the intelligence. Someone's going to know something about what could happen. And if you have boots on the ground or informants, that's the way it will be prevented. They can disrupt it from that level. It can't be disrupted from the level of freedoms we have in the United States. You can't prevent somebody from buying the things that would be necessary to create a bomb, only that someone that's involved in that, selling the person these materials, may say, hey, wait, this doesn't look right. I think I'm going to call the FBI. That's what we count on to prevent something like that from happening.
And Jeff, of course, 9/11, and all of us, all parts of the world, can remember where we were exactly. It was such clarity when that tragedy happened, and that led to the death of over 3,000 tragically in downtown New York. And quite understandably at that time, FBI and other agencies, their focus was on offshore international terrorism, Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda. Jeff, would it be fair to say that even allowing for that, if we take 9/11 out of the equation, domestic terrorism is responsible or far more likely to take lives in the US than international terrorism? Would that be a fair comment?
I think the FBI would agree with that comment today. I'm retired from the FBI, but I think when you hear the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, testify before Congress, and you listen to his comments, domestic terrorism, he says, is a greater threat than international terrorism in terms of the possible depth of that and damage that from a physical standpoint and lives that could be lost as well. I think the FBI echoes that point. And so that's why the FBI is trying to disrupt those organizations, those domestic terrorism organizations that may be planning future attacks or just disrupting our democratic society that we have in the United States in a variety of different ways.
Here we are. I'm sitting here in Australia on the other side of the world, up there in the States, and 9/11 changed our world down here. We couldn't be any further away from Ground Zero in the financial district of Manhattan, but it changed our world. It changed everything with regards to international travel and that type of thing. I'm wondering, Jeff, on a domestic terrorism front, if the instance of Timothy McVeigh, the 1995, the Oklahoma bombing, did that in any way change the FBI and where their focus was and where their emphasis was? Did it lead to any increased funding or anything such as that? Was there a marked change after what I think would be the biggest domestic terrorism episode in US history?
There was a lot more focus on that as a threat. Absolutely, funding was increased. Every time there's some type of event, you look back and say, what could we have done differently? And so that, and generally Congress in the United States provides the resources for the FBI to prevent a future act from occurring. That maybe if we had the funding and the resources, could have prevented that from happening in the first place. But you're always looking back. You're playing Monday morning quarterback and saying, well, what could we have done differently that would have prevented that from happening? No one was expecting, someone in the Army to get a truck and load it up with racing fuel and kill a bunch of people in the United States. And how would we have prevented that, even if we had the resources to do that? So you always have to look back and say, here's what happened. Here's what could have been done that would have given knowledge of this particular attack. And really, when you think about what happened in Oklahoma City, that was almost, a duplicate of what happened in the World Trade Center attacks in 1993 in terms of the device that was used. Also, a rented truck containing, again, ammonium nitrate and racing fuel mixed together, about the same amount of that, and driven into a parking garage under the World Trade Center's hotel between the two Twin Towers on February 26, 1993. It wasn't a suicide bomb. It was a fuse, and the person got out of the truck and left the scene, and that bomb went off. And it didn't take down the buildings, as we know, but it caused quite a bit of damage, and several people died in that attack.
I'm interested, what was the motivation there? Those offenders, were they domestic, were they overseas? And what was the outcome when that got to trial?
Yeah, so the 1993 attack, which is often forgotten on the World Trade Center, was not Osama bin Laden. It was another terrorist group. It was a group of people that literally wanted to take down the World Trade Center, but they didn't have enough resources to do that. They weren't hijacking planes like we saw on 9/11. They tried to blow up the centerpiece, the hotel between the two towers, and they thought that was going to topple both towers down. And the guy that was arrested that drove the truck containing the ammonium nitrate and other bomb mixtures under the garage into the World Trade Center, the hotel between the two towers, was named Mohammed Salame. And he was part of a group not associated with Osama bin Laden. I'm talking about 1993 here. All right, so he drove the truck in there. He escaped from the site and was later arrested at the Ryder Rental Truck Agency in Newark, New Jersey, where he tried to get his $400 deposit back. So there were many people associated with that attack, which the FBI later pieced together, and all those people were arrested within a short time. They all went to trial, and most of them, if not all of them, today are still in prison for that attack after multiple trials in the international terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in February 1993. And they're still in jail today, the ones that are still alive.
Coming up, the trench coat robbers and why they were different from run-of-the-mill bank robbers.
Two notorious bank robbers known as the trench coat robbers, Ray Bowman and William Kirkpatrick, were believed to have robbed perhaps around 28 banks in the US. Can you give us a little bit of an insight to the trench coat robbers?
Most bank robberies in the United States occur when someone walks up in a bank, passes a note to a teller. They may or may not have a weapon, and they get a couple $1,000s from one teller drawer, and then they leave, and they may get caught on that occasion, or after they've done that a couple times. That's a typical bank robbery in the United States. These guys were different, so they planned it out, and they wore. The reason why they're called the trench coat robbers is because they wore trench coats, raincoats, and hats, and they basically covered, pretty much their whole body, and their faces were covered up pretty much with sunglasses as well, so they couldn't be identified so easily. And they did come in with weapons. I mean, high caliber shotguns, and they had it planned out every time. They always got into the bank at the time where the vault was open. So I don't know how they do things in Australia, maybe the same way. Banks have vaults that are generally opened up if they need to get additional funds during the daily activities of a bank. And these guys came in, they always got into the vault. They got a lot of money during every bank robbery because they were able to get money out of the vault. We're not talking about teller drawers where there's a couple $1,000s. We're talking about getting into the vault and getting hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in a couple of the cases as well. They knew what they were doing. They planned it out, and they were really good at it. They told everybody, don't do anything and no one's going to get hurt. And they took a lot of money from all the banks over the years that they committed those bank robberies, which was about a 15-year period of time.
You mentioned that, of course, they go into a bank, they're never going to really know how much money's there, how much they can access. One of them, Lakewood, Washington, they netted $4.4 million just from that one branch alone. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it?
That's a huge haul. And they were there for several days planning it out. They watched the bank, and they had money from previous bank robberies, so they could afford to stay in hotels and just, they weren't working, they were just robbing banks, right? And so they watched the bank, and they saw when the local casino would make a drop of the funds from the casino into the bank. And they knew that when that was going to happen. And they timed their robbery for when after that happened, because they know there'd be a lot more money in the vault at that time. So that's how good they were. And the one in Washington that you're talking about, that's exactly how they did it. And they got over $4 million from that particular robbery alone.
It was estimated that they were operating from about 82 to 97. So that's 15 years that they're going in and out. I mean, that requires some degree of well, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but to evade capture for 15 years, regularly committing robberies, 28 of them, they're pretty good at what they do, to be fair.
They were great at what they did. They were the most prolific bank robberies in the history of the United States, bank robbers. And they knew what they were doing. And so they wore gloves. There was no fingerprints, no forensic evidence left behind. They picked their banks so they'd be great targets for the money, as I just mentioned, but also so they'd be further away from law enforcement. If someone did pull trigger a bank alarm, that they knew how far away the police station was and where potentially police would be and how fast they can get there. All that stuff went into their planning, and they had plenty of time to plan because they were getting so much money from these bank robberies. They didn't have to go to work at a regular job. They could sit back and wait weeks or months to do the next robbery and plan it out so they would not get caught. And that's why they were so good.
And I'm imagining with a 15-year time span, close to 30 banks, that would have been across a multitude of different states in America, or did it all occur in one area?
No, that was all over the United States. So it was like Washington was one state that you mentioned where they got 4.2 million, but they were all over the United States, and they traveled in all parts of the U.S. to stake out the particular banks they wanted to rob. So it was multiple states, multiple robberies over a 15-year period, and they got a lot of money, a lot of cash.
So in a case like this, Jeff, I'm just interested, once the FBI or others start to see a pattern in these robberies, we start to perhaps get an MO, a modus operandi, which links these offenders. I'm interested in the mechanics and behind that. Would the FBI put a task force together on that then investigates that, a team? How does that work?
Oh yeah. A task force would have been established early on, in the early 80s. And over time, as things die down, it's been a year since a bank robbery. Maybe there's only a few people on the task force versus multiple people after a specific robbery. So, ebbs and flows based on what's happening. But the task force would have definitely been established. They were been an open case and agents assigned throughout the United States on those robbers. And again, if there's a year or two between a robbery, then they're doing other stuff too. They're not sitting at a desk in full time working on a case like that because they have other things to do as well. But the task force concept is very important, Brent, because that brings together a lot of resources, police officers, FBI, and other resources that help solve cases.
Do you know, Jeff, what actually led to their arrest? Were they sort of caught in that sort of movie depiction, walking out in disguise with the bags with the money insignias on them, or how'd they get done in the end?
Oh, in a kind of a funny way. It wasn't like we figured out who they were and we tracked them and we got them coming out of a bank. No, that's for the movies. The way they got caught was, again, a simple mistake. If you're going to commit enough crimes, you eventually, no matter how good you are going to mess up. They decided to retire. Right? They're not going to rob any more banks. They're getting old. They decided they had enough money. They weren't going to do it anymore. And so one of them, Kirkpatrick, is driving from Las Vegas, his last residence. He's going to move to Minnesota and retire. And so he's in a rental car, and he's driving through the United States. He gets pulled over for speeding in the state of Nebraska by a state trooper. And the trooper thought that he had a rental car and he's driving from Las Vegas to Minnesota. The trooper thought maybe he's running drugs from Vegas to Minnesota. And he says, "Can I look in your trunk?" And Kirkpatrick goes, "No, you can't look in my trunk." I mean, he knew his rights. The officer had no legal cause to open up his trunk. And so the trooper said, "Okay, we're going to get our drug-sniffing dog out, and we're going to do a little investigation with the dog to see if you have drugs in your trunk." And so he detained him long enough. The dog came, and the dog hit on something in the trunk. And now you have to know, Brett, that the residue of drugs, cocaine, which is closely associated with large amounts of money in the United States, is probably on large bills, $100 bills or less than that. And so you're often going to get a hit by a drug-sniffing dog on large amounts of money, even if there's no drugs involved, no large amounts of drugs. So the dog hit on drugs in the trunk, which was associated with probably the money that was in the trunk. So now the trooper had the probable cause to open up the trunk. Opens the trunk, he finds hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, guns, trench coats that they used in the robberies. And so basically they took him into custody, and he was eventually tied to those robberies. Now, he wasn't going to give his buddy up, Mr. Bowman, who lived in Missouri, which was basically 5 miles from the FBI office in Kansas City. He wasn't going to give him up. But Kirkpatrick's girlfriend thought she was going to get prosecuted for knowing about what they had done. She gave up Kirkpatrick's co-conspirator, Bowman, and said, "I know who else was involved in this case." And so the FBI gets the lead in Kansas City. We drive 5 miles over to the guy's house, and sure enough, we find guns and trench coats and money that he had in his house in Missouri, and that's how the case was broken.
Now, Jeff, I do have to mention there was one thing you didn't include. They found 2 bags of fake moustaches. Now, that's
I forgot. Sorry about that.
That's worthy of mention. That's worthy of mention, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, always driving around with your car with fake mustaches and stuff, along with with what else was in there as well. So, yeah, the trooper definitely, and the guy's just driving. Here's what you always think about that. You put yourself in the mind of a criminal, which we're not. But if we were, wouldn't you just drive the freaking speed limit and not get pulled over?
Yeah. And you wonder why when he's packing that trunk, he's in retirement and he's looking at those 2 bags of moustaches thinking, yeah, I need to take those. I need to take those with me. I mean, just the fact that they had that many different moustaches to fill 2 bags
Or the coats. Or the coats for that matter. Why do you need the trench coats anymore? Dump them in a dumpster in Las Vegas before you head to Minnesota. The money, I know you want the money, but the rest of the stuff, really?
Yeah, because maybe the money on its own without the disguises and everything else, it might have been a more difficult case to crack. But so these guys I'm picking would have been getting on in age a little by the time they got locked up and sent away.
Yeah, I don't remember the specific ages of these guys, but they were retiring from bank robbery. I think they were 60s plus.
Jeff, we were talking off air about the sort of, and it's probably the wrong word, almost the nostalgia that we attach to bank robberies and bank robbers. We've all watched movies and things such as that, and it's that sort of, it's a crime that I know it's not a victimless crime, but it's a crime that sort of we seem to somehow set apart from others. I'm interested, these 2 characters, Bowman and Kirkpatrick, What was their track record with? Because you mentioned earlier they're going into some of these banks, these branches with high-powered weapons. Did they ever use them? Was anybody ever killed or injured?
No, in their particular robberies, fortunately, there were no injuries in the robberies. They didn't have to use their weapons. There was enough firepower there to deter anyone from taking action, which might have resulted in a violent act. But it's interesting you should point out the nostalgia of bank robberies in the United States, which goes back to, times of Bonnie and Clyde, where they became folk heroes, right? They robbed banks, and, it was during the Depression in the United States in the 1930s. And, we're getting people that are kind of like, they're part of the victims of the Depression, yet they're robbing the man. They're robbing the man, and they were successful, and they became folk heroes. So the nostalgia from those particular bank robbers back in the Depression era has continued to this day. But most bank robbers are not like that, right? There are people that go in there, they may be on drugs, they may be violent. They go in and they, to the tune of 5,000 robberies in the United States every year. They pass a note to a teller. Maybe they use a gun. Maybe there's some violence. That's the kind of bank robbery we're dealing with today. There should be no nostalgia associated with any of that.
Over 5,000 bank robberies a year still committed in the US. And it's a crime that we do tend to not hear as much about, but clearly it's still a very active crime category in the States.
Yeah, it doesn't receive a lot of publicity because generally, unless someone gets hurt, because it is so common. And that's not a sad thing to say, because it's become so commonplace that the media doesn't even report on it anymore. It's like man bites dog. That would get reported on, but dog bites man, no big deal. So, it doesn't get publicity because it's too common, and that's really sad.
I just want to thank you so very much for joining us across there on the east coast of the United States. It's been such an interesting chat. It's speaking about a few cases, one in particular, the Oklahoma bombing, that many of our listeners will have a very clear memory of. I want to thank you for your 20 years service to the good folks of the US during your time in the FBI. It's been lovely to meet you and have a chat to you, Jeff. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.